Anyways, yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk about bats, something I enjoy, also caves. So today I just wanted to kind of run through what we know about bats in Montana, and I think there's a really cool story here with agency folks like me who also enjoy caving, and then a lot of you in this room who've actually helped to get data that we really need, and in turn provide good information for the management of caves. And ultimately, I think, you know, what we've done in Montana and kind of the Northern Rockies is really unique across the U.S. and has really been a really cool thing to be involved in. So I think this probably isn't a big surprise to any of you guys. We have about 425, probably more than that, caves at this point that are known throughout Montana. You know, typically they're clustered in a few spots. You know, we have that big cluster in the Bob, which we've seen a lot of, or a lot about this weekend. The Little Belts also form quite a few caves, as do the Snowies, which are kind of in that central Montana area. We have a big plug of limestone out in the prairie up kind of right below the text box. That's the Little Rockies. That's home to Azure Cave, which was formerly the largest overwintering population of Myotis bats west of the Mississippi, excluding Arizona, where they have a cave obligate species, or cave adapted Myotis species. So that was pretty important. Also the one that Emily talked about yesterday, crashing down to about 40 individuals right now due to white nose. Also the Pryor's down kind of right above the Caves Montana survey, holds a lot of caves, and also a lot of bat caves. And then you can just see, you know, where we have limestone across the western part of the U.S. Montana. We also get occasional caves, and yeah. So we also have 15 species of bats in the state. These have a really wide diversity of ecological kind of life history stuff. We have everything from our tree roosting bat species, which are the hoary bat, eastern red bat, and silver-haired bat, as well as some more cave-adapted species or cave and mine associated species like our Townsend's big-eared bat. And they show a lot of diversity in overwintering strategies. Some of these, such as our eastern reds and hoaries, disappear. We think that they either go to the Pacific coast or down into the southeastern U.S. We actually don't know where they go because they're really hard to put a tag on. These aren't elk. You know, you can't strap a couple pounds of, you know, GPS stuff. You know, these are animals that might weigh 12 grams or something like that. So the tags that they make are really hard to, number one, attach for any length of time. They groom them off. If they do stay attached, they have a really limited detection distance. So you almost need to fly a plane. And if these guys are moving, you know, 50 to 100 miles a night during migration, it's really easy to put a bunch of tags out and just never see them again. So, you know, we are working on that. There is some really exciting technology that uses a series of towers, and bats will ping, and we're starting to learn more, but it's kind of in its infancy. So plenty to learn here. A really interesting example of that is our silver-haired bats, which do occasionally use caves in other areas. We haven't documented that in Montana. Just saw a presentation at a bat working group meeting a couple weeks ago where a guy was looking at the isotopes. You drink water in a given area, it actually gets incorporated into your tissues, and then if you take a tissue sample, you can actually pinpoint where you were spending time when your cells were growing. So if you look at this in the Pacific Northwest, he was over in Vancouver, BC, they find bats, or silver-haired bats, that have a similar isotopic signature to bats in the Northern Rockies. So pretty good evidence that at least some of our silver-haireds are boogieing out to the coast. We also know from this MODIS technology, which is the towers and tags, that we have our, you know, silver-haired bats in the Bitterroot Valley boogie south. We have one individual that hit a tower in Idaho down in the Snake River Plain and disappeared after that. So pretty interesting. Those guys are maybe going to the Pacific coast further south. We also record calls, echolocation calls in the winter in Montana. So at least some of them are hanging out here. So they're showing this kind of divergent ecology. A few other species which are pretty cool, spotted bats, pallid bats that just disappear in October. No idea where they are, and they start showing up again in June. If any of you guys spend time in the Pryors, you know, on the horse thief, bighorn stuff, if you hear clicking at night, like a echolocation. Spotted bats are the only species you can actually hear echolocating with your ears. So keep an ear out. Really cool animals. They're one of the rarest mammal species in North America. So. And then we're going to get to species that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today. These are the species that we either know overwinter in Montana or we think overwinter in Montana. And I don't know if you can see it, but I highlighted them in these blue boxes. So that's about 11 of our 15 bat species we've observed in caves and mines, or we've recorded on echolocation detectors in the winter when they get up and fly around. So to kind of tie those two things together, we've always known that bats are associated with caves. I mean, you look at the NSS logo, it's a bat. They're kind of, a mascot for the caving community, but, people have been recognizing this for, hundreds or thousands of years. But in Montana, we really don't know much about, or we didn't know much about how bats were using our caves prior to about 2010. And, Newell Campbell's book had some references like, oh, there's bats in this cave. You'd look at cave maps, there's bat rooms like in Whitaker Sink. We also had some survey data from a few of our larger systems. Azure Cave had been studied by biologists in the 90s, folks doing mist netting in the summer to catch animals moving out, as well as going in the winter and doing counts. Same with Mystery Cave. There was a grad project where they were banding bats within that cave, as well as Little Ice, which is about a mile away. And we're still finding those bands that they deployed in 89 and 90 on dead bats in there, and bats dying in places where we walk. So, you pick them up, you find a band, you go back a couple years later, you do the same thing, you can be reasonably certain that some of these bats have died within a given time range, and that would put their age, in about my age, late 30s. So that's pretty impressive for an animal that, is about the size of my thumb, and compared to like mice, which live maybe 18 months if they get really lucky. That's, absolutely phenomenal. So we didn't really know tons of stuff, but we knew enough to know that we needed to know more. And what really kind of pushed that need for knowledge was white nose syndrome. I think all you guys who were here yesterday saw Emily's talk about what we're doing, so I won't go into too much detail, but it's a fungal disease, hammers the snot out of some of our small bat populations, responsible for declines up to 90, close to 100% of some populations on the East Coast. And it was originally, or first detected in North America in New York in about 2006. They found a bunch of dead bats outside of a cave, and it's been slowly spreading further westward. This map here, you can see the blues and greens are kind of the initial detections, and then the warmer colors, the reds and the oranges, are the more recent detections. But this red line here shows right around the time we decided that we needed to get serious about figuring out what our bats were doing, both in the summer and the winter. So this was really this kind of start of the project. And I know a number of you folks in the room here, and who've also been here this weekend, sat down and really worked to address this need for data and kind of hash out, how we could actually provide information that's relevant to the management of bats, management of caves and recreation. And I should say, I'm not an agency biologist. The program I work for does not manage nor make decisions about cave closures and recreation restrictions. But we've been involved with this group, including the Grotto, the Cave Club, federal and state wildlife and land managers that all kind of sat down and really addressed this need and decided to work together. And this is something that is pretty rare across the U.S. and I think has really benefited both our management of these species as well as promoting recreation. We wouldn't be anywhere in our knowledge of caves without participation in the Grotto, and I think that's huge and really cool. So got together, kind of came up, and I say the royal we. I had not started in my position, so this was Bryce Maxwell, who was here yesterday, Lori Hanuska Brown, who was here a little bit this weekend, as well as some of the Grotto members who've been here for a while, but kind of determined the need to really assess how bats were using the caves, the numbers of bats, when they were found in caves, when they're not, And also do some more kind of scientific stuff. Assess whether our caves could support this fungus, provide baseline data to assess these populations before. So once white nose hits, which it has, we can start to talk about declines, at least for our cave roosting bats. And then really inform if and how we could manage these resources, or the need to manage those resources. So part of that was, first and foremost, identifying cave locations. We knew of some, BLM knew where some caves were, Forest Service did as well, but there's a lot of holes in the ground that, you guys knew about, but we didn't. And I mean, all of you know the value of cave data, specifically names of caves, locations of caves, and how tightly protected that is. And I really think that speaks to the level of trust and understanding that occurred, that, the Cave Survey was willing to share those for scientific purposes with us to get these surveys done. So went in, did formal counts. Also, we rely on incidental survey data. You submit a trip report with bats in it that goes into our database and helps us, again, assess population trends within caves. And then we also did stuff like deploy acoustic monitors and things to measure temperature and humidity. If you ever see either of these devices in caves, please just leave them be. Although at this point we haven't deployed them for a while, so we might have forgot that they were in there. So it might be helpful to let somebody know about that. And also just to kind of think about potential overlap between the needs of the bats and needs of people exploring these features. So across there, we surveyed about 105 caves. This is higher now. These numbers are a few years out of date, which is about 300 and something surveys. Detected about 46 hibernacula within that. So about a little under half of the caves we've surveyed have had bats in the winter, so are used as hibernation features. That's a pretty high number, but kind of talk a little bit more about why that is or isn't significant. Additionally, in about a fifth of our caves, we found bats during the active season. And I think this is also kind of underrepresenting, because I do think bats do use caves in the summer, but maybe they're a little bit more difficult to detect. So, these statistics are kind of give you a general idea, but there is a significant bias. We've been targeting caves that we think have bats for survey. So there's probably, if you considered all the caves that don't, or maybe aren't suitable, it's significantly less than that, 40% number. So I'm going to show a series of figures here. I'm sorry if you haven't taken a stats class in a while. These are kind of walk through these, but these are just what we call a histogram. So it's the number of caves in a different bin. So on the horizontal axis here, this is the maximum number of bats we've counted in a cave. On the vertical would be the number of caves that we've observed those bats. So if you look at this, you can see that most caves that we surveyed had between 0 and about 50 bats. We do have a few caves that have, over 500. That would be Mystery, and then Azure, which had up to about 2,000, and I believe more, because they kind of roosted in some inconvenient spots. But to kind of get a little bit more depth to that low bar there, we actually see that most of our caves have between 0 and 5 bats. The majority of ones that don't have that really low number have under 25, and we just have a handful that are really kind of in that 35 to 60. And those represent maximum counts in the winter, so we often count lower numbers than that as well with repeated visits. So we don't have a lot of bat use in our caves, and even when we do have bats using caves, we don't have that many bats. I should mention here, bats are not rare. They're ubiquitous across the landscape. You wander around with a bat detector, you see lots of bats almost everywhere. We actually use the presence of bats to kind of test our equipment. If we're not recording bats, we kind of default to saying that that was an error in the equipment rather than a true lack of presence of any of these species. So to see these low numbers in these caves means that, it's kind of surprising, begs the question of where they're actually ending up. But it's certainly not in these roosts. We do see some geographic trends when we start looking at the number of bats counted in caves. Big circles are more bats, little circles are less bats. You can see as we get out into the prairies and kind of southern Montana, we start seeing more. Little Belts have a couple big, a couple hundred bat roosts. Azure Cave, which is down to 40 bats, previously had about 2,000. And then Mystery Cave and Little Ice down there had a bunch of bats. But generally, we don't see bats in many of our caves in any appreciable numbers. Same holds true for mines. We did find that 8 of our species, or 7 of our species were confirmed to use caves, but one species I think is difficult to parse from little brown bats, so I'm pretty sure they're in caves. They just aren't there, or a little bit difficult to actually pin down without genetic testing, which we haven't done. But most commonly, these are ordered from kind of the most commonly encountered species to least. So Townsends are in a lot of caves, and there's usually about 10 of them, all the way down to fringed myotis, which we have 2 known caves, and we average 1 to 2 bats per those caves. So it's kind of what we were expecting, although again, in much lower abundance than we had thought. We also took a look, this is prior to PD and white nose actually coming into the state, and looked at the temperature and humidity to see if our caves would support growth of the fungus. There's a cool paper where they went in and they grew a bunch of fungus and challenged it, does it grow in low humidity, high humidity, low temperatures, high temperatures. So this figure here shows temperature in degrees centigrade on our horizontal axis and humidity as a percent between 0 and 100% relative humidity on our vertical axis. And from that paper, I threw in a line showing whether PD grows the best. So anything above that blue line would be expected to support the fungus. And anything to the left of that red or orange line there is a cold enough temperature to support fungal growth. All the dots are various caves, and I went ahead and highlighted our 5 largest roosts with those green diamonds. So you can see that 4 of those 5 fell squarely in that minimum, or in that area where we're likely to see fungal growth. And since I put this together, Azure Cave went PD positive and crashed, and you can see that Azure's that one with the highlighted with the arrow, so makes sense. That's a good spot to grow fungus, and we saw that 98% decline. To look and see if there was any kind of trend with the depth of cave or length of cave, I wanted to explore that just to see if we could predict other caves that should be worth survey. So all these numbers on this figure represent the top 10 hibernacula. So the top 10 caves where we found, large abundances of bats. On the bottom are the cave length, at least from surveys in feet, as well as depth in feet on the Y, or the vertical axis there. So you can see that most of our numbers are kind of above the average depth of all caves that have been measured in the state, and are typically longer than the average length for most of the state, although there are some notable exceptions that are either close to average or in one case below. So we see a little bit of indication that bats like long caves, they like deep caves, but it's not a really strong signal. And I also looked at where caves were, and this isn't adjusted for latitude, so take it with a grain of salt, but just looked at the elevation of all the cave entrances and found that the average is the red bar there. The average elevation of our top 10 bat caves is the blue bar. So bats were maybe selecting for caves that were a little bit higher, although again, this isn't a strong signal and we didn't account for different various latitudes. I think one of the most interesting things, though, is we typically think about bats using caves in the winter. They go into hibernate, it's a cold environment, they can turn down their temperature and kind of hang out without burning a bunch of energy. So we were interested if there might be how much use they were, or how active bats were in the winter, but also how active bats were in caves in the summer, because we don't see them that often, but they still could be in there. We don't often spend nights in the cave, and we certainly don't look for bats at night in caves if we're in there a little bit late in a cave trip or something like that. So this one on the left shows the number of bat passes by these bat detectors. That's a bat flying by a microphone. By December, January, February, and March is on the horizontal axis there. And it might be hard to see the numbers, but we have 1, 2, and 3 bat passes. Bats aren't super active in the winter. They're mostly sleeping. But you can see that, on most days at Lick Creek Cave, we had at least 1 bat flying around within there. Kind of makes sense. If you look to the summer, this is starting at June all the way through October, we actually see some of the highest amounts of activity kind of in the mid to late fall, and that coincides with breeding. So this might be animals kind of checking out swarming sites where they get together, males and females, make more bats. So that's kind of how I interpret that. Also juveniles may be probing areas looking for hibernacula or suitable places to spend the winter. One interesting thing, though, is we also had this question of whether folks going into, in particular, Lick Creek Cave, because it's a little bit more accessible unless we have high snow years, would be negatively impacting the bats, waking them up, causing large increases in activity. And it's hard to see here, but I actually have some of the dots on that hibernation figure either coded as blue or red. So if it's a red dot, that's days where the trail camera picked up crews of people going into the cave, which this winter was actually fairly frequent since there wasn't a lot of snow on there. And if you look at it, there were definitely days where we were recording bat passes where folks were in the cave, but there were also a lot of days where we didn't record bat passes and people were also in the cave. So it's kind of hard to really assess that with the technique that we used, but it looked like there wasn't like a really strong relationship between people being in there and like hundreds of bat passes. Like they woke everybody up and the bats were flying around. So that looked promising, although by no means would this be a reason to go in bat caves in the winter. So to kind of further dissect that recreational impact, we're primarily concerned about disturbance during the winter. We don't want to wake them up because that causes them to burn energy, and they might not survive the winter as well. And particularly with white-nose positive caves, you don't want to make them burn any more energy than they absolutely have to, because that's one of the reasons why they potentially would suffer mortality events. It's just kind of running out of gas in the middle of the winter when there's no bugs to eat. So, I think we're in a good spot in Montana. Our largest hibernacula, that's Mystery and Azure Cave or BLM caves that were previously gated to protect mineral resources. That also has a good de facto benefit for bats because there is no disturbance in the winter. These aren't commonly permitted for recreation. It's pretty much science in the summer and they don't get much visitation. So they're kind of out. And again, those are our two largest. That Azure was 2,000, Mystery is about 500. Many of the caves, even if they have bats, are inaccessible during the season when we'd expect impacts. There are tons of it's really difficult to get through the snow up to some of these. It's miles of hiking, snowshoeing, skiing. I mean, many of you have been on these surveys. It is not easy to get in there. And that provides this really cool benefit because if people can't get in there, there's no overlap between recreational activities and disturbance of bats. There are a few caves, though, that we do see overlap. Lick Creek Cave and Lick Cave are two that often have low snow years and people know about, so people, visit. And I think, Forest Service has discussed gating Lick Creek Cave. I'm not sure where that's at, but that's, again, not necessarily a bat protection thing. That's primarily to dissuade folks from hauling out speleothems, which seems to be a more recent problem. So kind of as a result of this, I know the Grotto put together what would be a closed cave list, which is just a list that's available on the website of caves that maybe would be better to visit at midsummer rather than visit where when the bats are actually down for the count and hibernating. So another benefit of this, with this close working relationship, was really an emphasis on decontamination. I know Emily mentioned it yesterday, and I just wanted to kind of further a point there. When we talk about decontamination, we're not only worried about white nose, we're worried about what the next white nose is. If we try not to move stuff between caves, make sure that whatever we're doing would potentially kill any microbes, we're protecting these environments, which are pretty delicate, from something that we don't even know about. So the less we kind of move stuff around, the better. And to kind of wrap up here, in summary, we were able to establish this robust pre-white-nose baseline to at least assess bat use within caves before the fungus. And also, now that the fungus is spreading across the state, look at the impacts on our cave roosting bats. And really just get a better understanding of how these bats are using, which turns out is they're not really using many of our caves, which actually makes, I think, management a little bit easier. So geographic attributes were pretty predictive. Bats like longer caves, they like deeper caves, they like higher elevation caves. But again, these are just a handful of bats relative to how many are probably out and about on the landscapes. So yeah, that's all I got here. I hope that was interesting. And if you see bats in caves, let me know. I would love to chat about it. So thanks.